Good morning, dolls, and welcome to Little Gretchen's workshop. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I make a shirt for this male doll. His original shirt was kind of old and tattered, so I'm making him a new one. Now this doll's name is Pop, and he is a resident and a family member of the people that live in the rooming house Dollhouse. But his original shirt was looking pretty bad, so I felt like this was the perfect time to allow you dolls to watch me make him a new shirt. So I've selected this really nice blue color because his pants are like a navy plaid. Here I'm adding tacky glue along this edge to create a seam to close the sleeve. Now dolls, in addition to making sure I find small prints, I really prefer to use cotton fabrics. I find that cotton fabrics really work well in conforming to the doll body more so than synthetic fabric. Now I'm just pressing the edge of that seam to make sure it adheres good. And I'm just pressing the glue a little bit more with my needle tool to make sure it's a solid seam. Now, I always cut my sleeves a little bit bigger. My doll's arms are probably bigger than some standard 12 scale dolls, but I like their arms to be fuller, especially the men dolls, and so my sleeves are made a little bit bigger. Now, I do put a pretty ample seam in it, but if I make it too thick, I can always trim it off. Now, dolls, I'm cutting shapes for my doll's clothing. I don't have any actual patterns. I usually cut pieces just to match the shape of the body part I'm trying to cover. Now, in this frame, I'm repeating the process that I did for the other sleeve. And you see me here just squeezing those two seams together to make sure they take hold with the tacky glue. And here I'm just trimming off some excess around the edges of the sleeve and the underarm. Now you'll see me here in this frame just adding little snips around the edge of the shoulder and the entire open part of the sleeve, which is going to help me contour it neatly around his shoulder area and give me a nice finished edge when I'm done. Now these little cuts really help you to contour things around rounded or curved areas, and the technique is really handy whether you're doing any kind of doll clothes, dressing dolls, working with upholstered fabric, or even dressing a bed. It's just a very, very handy technique. Now that I'm confident that my sleeve seam is dry, I'm turning the sleeve right side out so that I can go ahead and try to fit it on my doll. Now take your time turning your shirt sleeves right side out. This would definitely be the time to trim that inner seam. Definitely do that before you turn your sleeve out, but just make sure the glue is dry enough that it won't pop loose when you turn it right side out. And again, you can see all my little slits, which are going to make it really easy to fit it around his shoulders. So now I'm going to just take a moment to try the sleeve on him to see if it fits, to see if it's too tight or too loose, because this would be definitely the time you would need to make any adjustments. Now I realized that I made it a little bit long, so I trimmed it off the shoulder and I trimmed off the excess around his hand and wrist. And so keep in mind, dolls, when you make a sleeve for the doll, you want it to be big enough to go around them, but you want it to be enough room that it will look natural. Now, when I'm making a men's shirt, I don't hem the wrist of the sleeve because I'm going to cover it with a cuff. And I really see here I had quite a bit of excess around my shoulders, and I'm cutting off all of my snips. So I'm actually going to have to redo the snips on his sleeve. Now you see me here quickly redoing my snips to make sure I can fit everything nice around his shoulder. Now dolls, I'm definitely being a lot more sparing with my glue when it comes to dressing my dolls, because you don't want the glue to show through or seep through the fabric because you use too much. But I did the exact same thing on the other sleeve, trimmed it out on the shoulders, and used the little tabs to make sure they fit neatly against his body. So I did add my little snips after I got this one on. Now, dolls, you want to make sure when you're doing the sleeve that you pull it all the way up so it completely covers the shoulder up to the neck, because when you add the body of the shirt on, you don't want any gaps between the fabrics because you want them to look like a solid piece. Now here you see I trimmed off the other sleeve, and I began to really work with the part around the wrist. Now I pulled the shirt sleeve up a little bit and tucked glue under the sleeve around the wrist to create sort of a pleated effect. Now here I am trimming the other sleeve before I repeat the process to tuck glue under. Now be advised, these clothes are being glued directly to the doll's body. They will not be removable. So you see me adding the glue around that sleeve and then pinching it so that it creates that little pleated effect that is around the wrist area before I add the cuffs. Now I'm going to give that opportunity to dry before I move on. Now here's a quick glance of how the sleeve looks around the wrist. Now this thin piece that I'm creating is actually going to be used to make the cuffs on top of the sleeves around his wrist. Now you want to do this as neatly as possible and make sure you cover up the ends of the sleeve. Now if you want to make a French cuff, you would cut it at an angle, but I'm going to do a more or less a simple basic cuff. Now, dolls, the width of your cuff is totally a personal preference. I tend to make mine a little bit thicker than a belt, and I usually close it under the palm of the hand. Now, again, it's totally up to you how you want to do it because there are a lot of different styles and different types of shirts. Now, this technique and style is pretty basic. You can modify it to suit any type of sleeve that you're making. Now, dolls, take your time with this part. Do it nice and neat. Make sure the end of the sleeve is completely covered. Trim it if you need to, but make sure it's completely covered. And make sure you fit it to make sure you know where it's going to sit before you actually add your glue. And when you've confirmed where you want the cuff to go ahead and add an ample amount of glue all the way around, and then begin to wrap it to cover all the raw edges of the sleeve. Cut it either straight or at an angle and tuck a little bit more glue. Now when you're completely satisfied with the first sleeve, go on and complete the other one and make sure it overlaps a little bit and is completely closed. And now you're ready to go on to the body of the shirt. Now I do have my collar here ready. Now I'm trimming off the excess. Now this I kind of make it like a big vest, almost to look like a smock. I do angle out a little bit when I trim off the part around the shoulders. Now watch how I do, dolls, as I cut out the neck, just sort of a U shape, and then I trim down the front. So it just looks like a sort of like a sleeveless vest. Now I'm going around the edges to glue the seams on both sides of the shirt. And at this stage, it kind of looks like a big sleeveless smock, but that's okay. Now you can use your finger or even a tool to just rub those seams together to make sure they lock together. And in this frame, I'm cutting more snips, and these are around the edges of the vest part of the shirt. And this is going to help you to make a really neat, clean seam around the sleeve area, around the shoulder. And in this instance, you're going to press those little tabs back so that they create a really neat, nice, finished edge around where the shoulder and the sleeve to the shirt meet. Now take your time with this. You want it to look as neat as possible because this is going to show on the outside of your shirt. So definitely take the time to do these really, really smooth. After you're satisfied with the first sleeve and make sure they're glued down neatly, be careful not to get the glue on the right side of the shirt. Go to the other side, create your little snips, add your glue, and neatly fold back those tabs on the other sleeve. Now after you're sure that all of your tabs are folded down nice and neat and you have a clean finished edge and the side seams of the little vest or smock are solid and dry, it's time to go ahead and fit it on your doll. Now dolls, this will just be a time to inspect the fit. Now you see me kind of pinching this part up here around his shoulder and his neck. Now that I see that the general shape of the shirt fits really nicely, it's time for me to really customize it to his body in particular. So the edges of the seams are good. I've got that nice neat line where we just folded down the tabs. Now I need to make it fit up around his shoulders and then add the collar. Now you see me just trying on the collar to just see how everything will lay. Now I realize that it looks a little loose and bunchy around his shoulder area, but it's no problem because the way I made the shirt, it's going to be easy to modify. Now, dolls, I want you to watch what I do in this particular part of the process to make it fit neatly around his shoulders. Now watch when I snip the fabric on the top of the shoulder. And I also want you to take note of that little gap, but the gap gives me allowance to fold around his neck and his arm area so that you won't see any gap. I added glue to the top of that shoulder and folded the top of the front of the smock under And then you see here, I fold it under and overlap it, adding glue. So again, that it fits really nice on top of his shoulder and actually giving him a sharper shoulder line. And here I am repeating the process I did on the first side, adding the glue, folding it down, and sealing it off on top of his shoulder. I know this is an awkward angle, dolls, but you see here I'm adding the glue on top of his shoulder and folding down that piece right flat against the top of his arm. And I'm doing the same thing on the other side. I'm adding the glue around the vest part of the sleeve. You don't want to add it to the sleeve top. You want to add it directly around the sleeve part where the vest is, and then lay the glue neatly across the shoulder. Now here I'm just smoothing it with my finger to make sure it lays down nice and neat. Now you see how that solved the fit, and it really tailored it nice to his body, so the shirt doesn't look like he's got on his big brother's shirt. It fits him really nicely, like it was made just for him. Now dolls, can you see how nice and neat it looks around his body now? Fitting things neatly around the shoulders and back are crucial. Now here I'm just adding glue down the front of his shirt because I want to add a placket, and I do want to add buttons as well. So after I added glue to close the front of the shirt, I added glue on top, and I just had a thin strip of fabric already set up and created, and it is thinner than the cuffs. It is more like a waistband. And after adding those, I put a couple dots of glue, and I actually used some rhinestone nail art to be my buttons. I just flipped them down where the sparkly side is not showing because this is a men's shirt. So I just let the flat side show as the front of the button. Now here I am, dolls, with this last thin piece of fabric, and I'm using this to make his collar. Now it's a little bit thicker than the placket, but it's still thinner than the actual cuffs. Now collars come in all shapes and sizes, dolls, so use these techniques and concepts to create the shirt collar that you want for your doll's outfit. Now doll, when I added the collar, I had glue all the way around the neckline and then had the first point cut. Now I make it a little bit longer, and I cut the second cut or point for the collar last after I fitted it around his neck and make sure it's sitting the way I want it to, because the last thing I want to do is cut it too short and it doesn't completely cover the entire top part of the shirt. And then I just snip it off at a little angle so that it looks neat and matches the other side of the collar. Make sure before you glue everything down that your collar is wide enough to completely cover the neck area at the top of your shirt. After you add your last little bit of glue, make sure you press it down until it catches and snip that part. And there you go. Your shirt is complete. Now we just need to tuck the shirt in and add the finishing details. And if you're creating a hem for a shirt that's loose and not being tucked in, you use that same concept of making the snips and contouring it into the shape that you want to for the hem. Now here I am playing around making a little tie. I just had a small piece of red polka dot fabric, and I think the little red tie looks really cute, and it kind of stands out next to all of this blue. Now dolls, I don't do anything amazing to make these little bow ties. I literally just cut a small piece of fabric, fold it over a couple times, and pinch it in the middle with my fingernail while the glue is still wet to make it look as though the bow is tied. Make sure that after it's dry, you trim off any frayed parts. So here, I'm going to just show you again how I did it, because I actually need one for another doll. So I'm just folding the fabric in. It's still a little damp from the glue. I'm clipping it down to size and just pinching it with my fingers and fingernail until it takes on the shape of a tied bow tie. And then I trim the edges off and allow it to dry. So to attach my little bow tie, I added a dab of glue right there to that center part where the two ends of the collar meet, and drop the tie right on top of that. You definitely want to give it a chance to dry before you handle it too much. And you see my buttons are all nice and dry. So I'm going to go ahead and tuck his shirt in so I can get him all finished up. So I push everything down to the top of his pants. I didn't add a waistband, dolls. I actually probably should have, but in his original design, I didn't give it a waistband, but you definitely can when you're doing slacks for men. I'm just giving him some quick suspenders to give the illusion that that's what's holding his pants up since he doesn't have a waistband or a belt on. So for his suspenders, I'm just using some of that jewelry cording. It's made out of suede. They make suede and leather in any craft department. And I'm just laying it right on top of that little bead of glue, pulling it around to the back. Now I am going to leave a little allowance in it because I like my suspenders to be tucked down into the back of the pants. So I'm just finding that area where I want to cut it and giving the front part a moment to dry before I manipulate it too much. So I let both of my fronts of the suspenders dry before I try to glue the part in the back. And I did eyeball the measurement for the other suspender based on the length of the one that I cut for the first side. Then I returned to the front to add the second suspender in the same area, added my little bead of glue and added the second suspender and just cleaned up the glue a little bit. I got a little messy there. Now when I was confident that the front of the suspenders were dry, I added glue to the back of his pants and then tucked in the other part of the suspender in the back, and I did it on both sides. And I did put an ample amount of glue because I don't want those suspenders to come loose. And you see I'm just pressing it down to make sure that the glue kind of goes through the shirt and the suspenders to make sure that his pants stay secure. Now in the front, I did add a little bit more nail art. Now these are just some of my brass studs or gold studs. I just added them to the front. I could have done it in the back, but I didn't, dolls. I just did him something very, very simple, very basic. I'm really pleased with the way he turned out. He looks very handsome and ready to start his new life with his new outfit on. So dolls, stay tuned for part 2 of dressing men dollhouse dolls. And I'm looking forward to seeing you on the next episode of Little Gretchen's Workshop. Bye-bye now, dolls.